Hello everyone and welcome to our Kaplan PSAT Scores Are Back Now What event. My name is Beth Hoffberg and I'm so glad to have you here with us today. But I'm not the only teacher here today. We actually have a whole slew of amazing PSAT experts who are also ACT and SAT experts actually. We're joined by Benji, David, Gordon, Karen, and Jane, all who are going to help you chatting in the chat. And we're all here to help you today. We've got lots of PSAT and ACT and SAT experience on deck today. So just please ask us any questions that you have. We really want to help you. That's what this whole event is about. Well, let me tell you about what we're going to cover today. So at Kaplan, we have strategies to master everything, whether it is a strategy for the reading comprehension section of a test, a strategy for tackling a specific question type, strategy for studying. We have strategies for everything. That's one of the reasons our students love us. So we also have a strategy to help you get from the PSAT to acceptance into college. And we're going to talk about this 5-step plan today. We'll focus a lot on understanding the PSAT score report. Then we're going to help you make a plan to decide whether the ACT or the SAT is going to be best for you or your student. Then, of course, you want to know what to do to get that high score so that you can be competitive in college admissions. And then the next step of the process is take the ACT or the SAT, the official test. We're not going to do that today, so don't worry about that. And then, of course, apply to colleges, and so we'll give you some tips on that as well. So now that you know our 5-step plan, let's take a look at what this looks like on a timeline. So don't worry if you haven't done all these steps already. I see that we've got about 50% of you are either sophomores yourself or your student is a sophomore. We've got about a third juniors. So for example, if the juniors, if you didn't do these things as sophomore, that's okay. Like, we're going to get you started wherever you are now. But for our sophomores out there and our parents and guardians of sophomores, the thing that, of course, your student probably did already was take the PSAT as a sophomore. And then really the rest of the time this year should be focused on exploring the ACT and the SAT. And there's lots of ways to do that. Kaplan actually offers a ton of great free events, including practice tests for the ACT and the SAT. We're going to give you a ton of information about the ACT and the SAT today so that you can figure out which test is best and just start to get used to the standardized test concepts. Tests are a really important part of college admissions. In fact, I'd love to know from you guys, what do you think are the top 2 factors that colleges look at in college admissions? You guys tell me that in the chat. I'd love to hear from everybody. And in the meantime, we'll talk about the plan for juniors while you guys chat me the 2 top factors. Okay, in 11th grade, that's when you really want to study for the PSAT. Now, if you already took the test or your student already took the test as a junior this year and they didn't study, that's okay. We're still going to use that score as a baseline and figure out what to do going forward. But for our 10th grade or even 9th grade or younger parents and families out there, if you can, you want to have your students study for the PSAT when they're going to take it as a junior. Then, of course, they take it as a junior. It's always in October. And then from there, that's where you really want to determine, like, are we going forward with the ACT or the SAT, and what is our plan? So in 10th grade, you're kind of exploring ACT and SAT, and in 11th grade, like, you really need to have your plan because that's the year that you're going to prep for the ACT or the SAT and take those official tests so that you can get the scores that you're looking for. Now, if you don't get the scores that you want as an 11th grader, you still have time. That's why we recommend that you take the ACT or the SAT as an 11th grader, because you can always take the test again as a 12th grader as needed. So at the beginning of your senior year, you can still take the ACT or the SAT again. Of course, the summer between junior and senior year, you can do that as well. That way you can get those great scores that you need to apply to colleges and then get into college. Because the top 2 factors that colleges are going to look at when deciding if they're going to admit you or admit your student is GPA, grades, and test scores, and specifically ACT and SAT scores. So these are really, really important in college admissions, and we want to help you make sure that you can put that best foot forward and succeed so that your students can really unlock their potential and get into the colleges that they want. Okay, so that is the path. So we said that the first step really, though, is to understand the score report. So let's talk about the PSAT score report. And before we can even really understand the score report, we have to understand the PSAT itself. So the PSAT is really just a practice SAT. It's the preliminary SAT. That's actually what it stands for. And it's really just a way for students to gauge their abilities, get some exposure to this kind of standardized test. Of course, a lot of students have exposure to standardized tests before this, but this one's a little bit different, and get them that practice so that they can really start working towards the SAT and the ACT. The PSAT has 4 sections of the test. It has reading, a writing and language section, which is like a grammar section, and then it has 2 math sections. One is without a calculator and one is with a calculator. Those are the same 4 multiple choice sections that are on the SAT, so that's why it's that practice version of the SAT. Now, another purpose of the PSAT is for the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. So you might sometimes see the PSAT written as PSAT/NMSQT, and that's what NMSQT stands for. Now, the National Merit qualifying round is only for juniors. So even if your sophomore got a perfect score on the PSAT, the only people who are eligible for National Merit are juniors. That's the only way that National Merit is considered. Now, one of the things that the PSAT is not used for is college admissions. Schools are going to look at your ACT scores or your SAT scores, or both if you submit both, and we'll talk about whether you should do that in a bit, but they don't look at your PSAT score for admissions. Now, if you do qualify as a National Merit semifinalist or a National Merit finalist, that's extremely prestigious. It's a really huge honor, and colleges would see that. That would be like an honor that you could put on your kind of like resume that you send to college, and you can list that off, and that can definitely help. But other than that, schools are not looking at your PSAT scores. They just care about your ACT and your SAT scores. So hopefully that helps you understand the point of the PSAT. It's really just for practice for most students. So even though it's for practice, there's still a lot that you can do with it. So let's talk about that. One quick check-in is on the timeline of the PSAT though. So I saw some people were saying, like, do I need to have my scores yet? What if I don't have my scores? Please, you can totally still stick around. All the information that we're going to talk about today is going to still be helpful for you. But as a lot of you were saying, like, you just got your scores via email, and that makes sense. So the PSAT is offered every single year in October. That's it. It's only offered in October. So like I said, if you're a sophomore, the next time that you'd be taking the PSAT is October of your junior year. You've got 10 months to get ready for it. And it's offered 3 dates in October. This year it was on the 11th, 14th, and 25th. And then on December 4th, so a little less than 2 weeks ago, the PSAT scores became available to school counselors. So you might have gotten your score from your school counselor, but then over the past few days in the last week, scores were released, and they were released based on region. So some of you might have gotten your scores on December 11th, some of you on the 12th, and some of you on the 13th, and they were all available through the College Board's electronic portal. So you should be able to access your scores there. You could even do that as we're going through today, or do it right after this event so that you can see your scores and make sure that you know what they mean. All right, so let's talk about the report. The report is going to give you a score from 320 to 1520, and that's what the PSAT is scored out of. And we would love to know your scores. So I know a lot of you have already chatted us your scores, and we've seen some amazing scores in the chat. Ray had told us that you got a 1430 on your PSAT. Way to go, Ray. That is so impressive. Congratulations. And we'll talk about like how I know that that's impressive in a minute. But if you have your scores or your student scores, totally you can let us know in the chat and we can help you understand them as well. It just also gives us a really good guide to know what we should talk about for you today, because we want to make sure that this is really helpful for you. So like I said, it's from 320 to 1520. The average, which is also in this case the median score, is the 920. So one way to kind of think about your score is, did I score above or below that average? And of course, like, you want to try to be above average, but hopefully even better than that, and we'll help you figure out how to do that. So the way that this score comes from, the 320 to 1520, is by taking your reading and writing scores. So like I said, the test has a reading section, a writing and language section, and 2 math sections. So it takes the reading and writing sections and it makes a score from 160 to 760. And then the two math sections become the math score from 160 to 760 as well. And then you add those two together, and then that's where you get the range from 320 to 1520. So if you also kind of think about it, if the lowest score is a 320, that is the score that you get simply if you just like put your name in and then don't do anything else, you would get a 320. And so there's a range of 1,200 points possible on the test. 1520 minus 320 is 1,200. So that's the range. Okay, so this is how the scores are distributed. And let's talk a little bit more about what this means in terms of a good PSAT score, because that's always what people want to know. Like, was my score a good score? And so I'm going to give you a few different ways to think about it. We already said, you know, try to be above average. That could be a way to decide, is your score a good score? Well, another way to evaluate if your score is a good score is if you've achieved the college and career readiness benchmarks. So the College Board, the test maker for the PSAT and the SAT, as well as the ACT, which is the test maker for the ACT, they both put out these college and career readiness benchmarks for their tests. And colleges then use these, especially on the ACT and the SAT, to evaluate whether your student is going to be successful at their college, because that's what they really want to do. They want to admit students who are going to be able to be successful at their school. They want to have people who are going to do a great job. So what you can do is look at the benchmarks for your 10th graders and for your 11th graders. Now I know that some schools do have PSAT 8 and 9, which is for 8th graders and 9th graders, but really the benchmarks are for 10th and 11th graders. So that's what we're going to focus on here. The benchmarks give you a 75% likelihood that your student is going to achieve a C or better in the first year of their college courses. So of course, schools want their students to get at least a C or better on their college courses or in their college courses, and so that is what these benchmarks indicate. So for 10th graders, that's a 430 on reading and writing, and 480 on math, and for 11th graders, that's a 460 in reading and writing and a 510 for math. So if your student did not score at these benchmark levels, that could be a really good indication that your student needs to do some more preparation. Because the other benefit of preparing for the PSAT or preparing for the ACT or SAT, aside from, of course, improving your scores, is that you can actually become more like a college student in the way that you think. So you're going to have those kind of strategies, you're reviewing the content and skills that you need to have in order to be successful in college. And so a lot of times in our preparation, for example, we focus not only on succeeding on the test, but also in getting you thinking like a college student and having that strategic thinking that you want to have when you're going to go to university. Okay, so that's another way of evaluating whether your scores are good. Another way to decide if you're have you gotten a good score on the PSAT is to compare percentiles. So a percentile is going to be the percent of students who you scored better than. So for example, if I tell you, this is a true fact, if I tell you that all Kaplan teachers have to have scored in a minimum score of the 90th percentile on every test that they teach, in order to even be allowed to apply to teach for Kaplan, you have to have scored on the 90th percentile or above. What percent, I'd love to hear from you all in the chat, what percent of students did we score better than? Or what percent of test takers do we score better than if we scored at least in the 90th percentile or above? I'd love to hear from y'all in the chat. And while you guys are telling me that, I'm going to explain a little bit more about these percentiles. So you can see that there are separate percentiles for 10th graders versus 11th graders. And that is because it's comparing 10th graders to just 10th graders and 11th graders to just 11th graders. Now, this is not what happens on the SAT or the ACT. For the SAT and ACT, your score is compared amongst all test-taking population. So it doesn't matter what grade you're in, you're compared against everybody else, which is why we typically recommend taking the ACT or the SAT as a junior. But on the PSAT, the reason that these are broken down differently based on 10th grade and 11th grade is because 11th grade is when you can qualify for national merit. Okay, so I'm not sure if you guys were able to figure this out for the percentiles, but if we scored in the 90th percentile, that means we scored better than 90% of test takers and we're in the top 10% of test takers. And in fact, for our live online teachers, which is the group of teachers who are working with you today, we're doing a live online event. We've typically scored in the 95th or even 99th percentile on our test. So you know that when you're talking to Karen or Jane or Gordon or Benji or David or myself, that you're talking to someone who really knows these tests inside and out, and we can really help you. Okay, so the other thing I want you to look at is how tightly clustered these scores can be. So if you take a look, I want you guys to tell me in the chat, how many more points did you need to get to go from the 70th to the 80th percentile? How many more points were needed to go from the 70th to the 80th percentile? And it actually is the same from 10th grade to 11th grade. So you could see we went from 1030 to 1090 in 10th grade, and 1120 to 1180 in 11th grade. That's the 70th to the 80th percentile. And yeah, as Jyoti is telling us, and Ray, that's 60 points. Awesome. So 60 points is going to translate into about 6 to 7 questions. It's roughly 6 questions, about 10 points per question on average. It's pretty close to that. So that is going to be the increase that you're looking for to go from 70th to 80th. But let's talk about what that actually means. Like, what is 60 points and how do we get 6 more questions right? Well, if there's 4 sections on the test, that means that you need to average 1.5 more questions right per section. Or another way to think about it is get 2 more questions right on 2 sections and 1 more question right on 2 sections. You only need to get about 6 or 7 more questions right to go up 60 points and jump up 10 percentile points. And because we're talking about, like, on the ACT and the SAT, there's about 2 million test takers per year. So if you jump up 10 percentile points, you're talking about almost 200,000 students that you are improving over when you are improving in that 10 percentile point range. And if you can be more competitive by 200,000 students, that's going to look awesome when it comes time for the ACT and the SAT and then applying for colleges. So that's why we really want to make sure that you're thinking about, what can I do to make these gains? How can I get 6 more questions right? 6 more questions right can make a huge difference. And even though it's only 60 points, that might not seem like a lot, that makes a big difference. Now, the other thing that I want you to think about in your percentile scores, a lot of times when we think about scores, we're like, oh, well, how close to 1520 was I? But that's really not what matters, right? You could have gotten an 1180 on the PSAT as a 10th grader. You could have gotten an 1180. That's pretty far from 1520. Like, that's pretty far. And if you were trying to do like the percent out of 1520, like, that would not be a very good like percent grade. But that's not how this works on the PSAT. What matters is the percentile. An 1180 for a 10th grader is a 90th percentile score. That's an amazing score. That means that you're in the top 10% of test takers. You're in the top 10% of all test takers in the world. You could be a 1360 as a 10th grader, even a 1450 as an 11th grader. You still, percentage-wise, are pretty far away from 1520, and you're literally in the top 1%. Right? So what you want to think about is not how far away from 1520 you are. You want to focus on the percentile, not the score. Okay, so that's one thing I really want you to think about. What percentile did I get, not what score? Okay, now the other way to think about whether your PSAT is a good score is whether you can qualify for national merit. And remind me in the chat, we talked about this before, what grade qualifies for national merit? There's only 1 year of students who qualify for national merit. And while you guys tell me about that in the chat, I'm going to show you what national merit cutoffs look like. So national merit is actually based on a score index, and the score ranges for the cutoffs vary from year to year. We will not know the score range cutoffs for 2017 until well into 2018. So we don't even know exactly when they're going to be announced. The College Board will announce them when they announce them. And so all we can do is share with you the information from 2016 because that's all that's known. The College Board has to still figure everything out before they can announce them for 2017. What they do, though, is they look at the top percentage of students and they do it by state. So every state is going to have a different cutoff. And then states that are more populated, like California, tend to have higher cutoffs than states that are less populated, say like Wyoming. So you can see the range for national merit cutoffs in 2016 was from 1380 to 1480. And just as a reminder, like let's go back. 1480 is above the 99th percentile. It's still in the 99th percentile because there's no such thing as above it. But that's in that 99th percentile. And again, we're only talking about 11th graders, right? Because as Angeline told me and Janet, the 11th graders or juniors are the only ones who can get that national merit score. Only juniors are considered for national merit. And again, while there is a PSAT 8-9 and there is a 10th graders can take it, only juniors are going to qualify for national merit. Now, I saw Jyoti had a question about like why is the max score 1440 for the PSAT 8-9, and that's actually really along the same lines of why is the max score 1520 when on the SAT the maximum score is at 1600. So the reason is because the PSAT is supposed to be a predictor for you of how you would score on the actual SAT if you took the SAT on that exact same day. Well, PSAT 10-11 is going to be harder than PSAT 8-9, and the PSAT for 11th graders is going to still be easier than the SAT. So like the SAT is from 400 to 1600. There's still that 1200 point range. It's just shifted over slightly to the right. PSAT for 10th and 11th graders is 320 to 1520. The max score is 1520. And then even below that then is the 8-9 where the max score is 1440. So the point there is that if you scored the perfect score on PSAT 8-9 and got a 1440, that would still just predict that you would get a 1440 on the SAT, not a perfect score on the SAT of a 1600, because the PSAT 8-9 is easier than the PSAT 10-11, which is easier than the SAT. Hopefully that makes sense. And again, the whole point is just to get you that practice and give you that baseline. So I'm going to give you one more way to think about whether your PSAT was a good score. And if the whole point of the PSAT, especially for non-juniors, is a practice SAT, but even for most juniors, the vast majority of juniors, for over 99% of juniors, the PSAT is for practice. So if you think about it like that, then literally any score on the PSAT is a good score because you've achieved the goal of practicing. And you can use that score to figure out what you need to do going forward. So if you have an 8th or 9th grader or a 10th grader, you want to be thinking about how competitive was your student's score and should they be preparing for their junior year PSAT. We would recommend that students do prepare for their junior year PSAT because they can see how much preparation really needs to go into it to get the scores that they want so that they're ready to prepare for the ACT and the SAT. And of course, preparing as a junior for the PSAT can make it a lot more likely that you earn that really prestigious National Merit Scholarship, which comes with a lot of money to pay for college. So that is why preparing as a junior is great. You can prepare as a sophomore or a freshman, but it's really not needed. Again, those are the practice PSATs. Okay, so that is how to determine if your score is a good score, and now hopefully you have a good understanding of the PSAT score report. So now let's talk about that next step of the Kaplan method to get you from the PSAT to college admission, which is choosing the SAT or the ACT. David is going to have a poll up for us that asks if you think that the SAT is the best test for you, the ACT, or both, and we'd love to have you guys fill that in and tell us along the way. You can change your answer at any time. We want to see what you think as we talk about the SAT versus the ACT, which test you think is going to be best for you. So first, let's talk about the tests themselves. And it's interesting because colleges tell us that they feel really confident that the SAT and the ACT are effective tools in measuring whether students are going to be successful at their college. That's why we have those college and career readiness benchmarks. In fact, there's also a benchmark that can indicate if you're going to get a B or better. So we really have found that when we survey admissions counselors, and then we do this every single year we talk to at least 300 admissions counselors. A lot of times it's even 500 admissions officers that answer our survey. And they tell us with 95% confidence that they like the SAT and the ACT. Now, I see so far that about 2/3 of you are telling us that you think both tests would be good for your student to take, and 1/3 are saying the SAT would be better. And it's really interesting because, in fact, we asked, like, are you confident about the SAT? Are you confident about the ACT? And 96% told us that they're confident about the ACT. And 94% told us that they're confident about the SAT. That's within the margin of error, so it averages out to 95, so it's still really close, but there's really not a preference of the SAT over the ACT. This is very surprising to many parents, and it's because there was a preference at one time. So I've been teaching for Kaplan for 11 years now, which means I applied to colleges a long time ago. So I graduated from high school in 2002. It's longer ago than I would really care to admit, but the reason I'm being honest with you about that is because when I applied to college, colleges did care whether you sent them the SAT or the ACT. And colleges maybe had a preference for one test or over the other. And it varied by region usually. So for example, I grew up in the Chicagoland area and we were like an ACT state. Illinois was an ACT state. So like colleges in Illinois, including Northwestern, they like really looked at the ACT more. But I wanted to apply to a lot of schools on the East Coast. And at that time, in 2001, when I was applying to college, 16 years ago, oh my gosh, when I was applying to college in 2001 and applying to schools on the East Coast, including some Ivy League schools, they tended to prefer the SAT over the ACT. So as a high schooler, I took both the ACT and the SAT. That's, again, because at that time, that's what mattered. Well, that is no longer the case. For at least 5 years, we have seen college admissions officers tell us with certainty that they do not have a preference of one test over the other. This is true regardless of college. Every single college in the US accepts both tests, and they look at both tests equally. This includes the Ivy League schools. I actually did end up going to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and they do not care about the SAT versus the ACT. They look at both tests equally, and they just want to see that your student did a good job. So now let's talk about, should you take both? And whether that's the right decision. So we asked admissions officers that too. We asked them, is there an advantage to an applicant submitting both an SAT and an ACT score? And 80% of admissions officers told us there's literally not an advantage at all. 2% were not sure. I don't know what's up with those 2%. 18% said that there is an advantage. But I actually want to look at this question a little bit more closely. It says, assuming both scores are strong. What this means, and what we've found, is that if you submit a score for both the ACT and the SAT, and they're not both strong, that could actually hurt your chances of admission. So when it says they're both strong, that means that they're both within the same percentile area. So for example, if you like rocked it on your ACT and you got a 94th percentile score on your ACT, that's like a really awesome score. And then on your SAT, you still did a great job, but you got an 88th percentile. Probably wouldn't make sense to submit your SAT score. That 94th percentile is much more competitive than your 88th. Now, if you got a 94th on your ACT and a 93rd on your SAT, send them both, and that could potentially help you have an advantage at 18% of schools. So that can help you decide if you should take both. But the other thing you want to think about is, do you really want to study for both? There are a lot of similarities between the tests, and in some ways studying for one test will help you for studying for the other test. But I also want to think about how much time and effort you would need to put in to get those competitive scores on both. So let's say that you have, I'm just going to pick a number, 50 hours to study for the ACT or the SAT. Well, if you're going to study for both tests, or your student's going to study for both tests, maybe they split their time. Let's say they split it evenly. 25 hours for the SAT, 25 hours for the ACT. That's fine. And like I said, some of that is going to help their overlap. So maybe, you know, like some of the hours they spent studying on the SAT will help them on the ACT and vice versa. But then think about comparing that to whether if they had only studied for one of the tests. Maybe they chose the SAT and they spent 50 hours studying for the SAT as opposed to 25 hours studying for the SAT. They're going to have such a higher score on the SAT if they're studying longer and, of course, using smart study methods, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's going to be a much better plan. So you really want to focus on which test is going to be best for me or for my student. Focus on that test. And if there's more time and they can study on the other test, by all means, that's great. But especially for juniors, you really at this point need to choose which test is going to be best for you and focus on that one before trying to work on both. Sophomores, you might be able to have still enough time to study for both if you can really put that time in, and I'll talk about towards the end, like a program that you can use to study for both, and same for freshmen. But juniors, you are really at the point now that we're almost done with the first semester of junior year, that you need to choose one test and focus on that, and then, and only then after you get a great score on that one, can you go back to the other test. So let's talk about how to choose. Okay, let's talk about how to choose. So we have a bunch of different factors. I'm going to go through all these different factors, and this is going to help you to decide which test is better. But there's no clear-cut answer. There's going to be a difference for every student. So I'm not going to come out at the end and say, like, so all of you should take the SAT or all of you should take the ACT. It's just not the case. It's really going to be dependent on personal skills, potential, and preferences. So let's talk about this first factor. The SAT is 3 hours and 15 minutes, and the ACT is 3 hours and 5 minutes if you don't count the essays. Just based on that factor, I'm curious which test, you guys can tell me in the chat, which test would you rather take? If there was no other difference between the two tests, would you rather have the 3 hours and 15 minute test or the 3 hours and 5 minute test? So some people are going to say, oh, I'd rather have the SAT because that means more time per question. You might not have thought of it like that. More time per question. And some people are like, oh my gosh, no, I don't need more time per question. I just need to like get in and get out. Like this is already such a long test. Like I cannot sit for an extra 10 minutes. Then they might choose the ACT. And the reason that we talk about this factor, because you should not choose whether you take the SAT or the ACT based on this factor. Like it's such a small factor. But the reason I wanted to have you think about it like that is because it just shows that there's no obvious answer on either side. There's pros and cons to both sides. So I want you to use that same level of analysis as we go through the other factors and compare the two tests. Okay, the score areas is another factor. So we already talked about the score areas for the SAT because they're the same as the PSAT. So you get that composite score, the score out of 1600 for the SAT. And then you get those scores based off of your evidence-based reading and writing score and your math score. Those are the main scores that schools are going to look at. There's sub-scores as well, but those are the main scores that schools are going to care about. On the ACT, you get a composite, and then get the 4 sections of the test. There's English, math, reading, and science. So what this means, and because of also how the scores are calculated, and I'll show you that range, so you get 1600 overall with 200 and 800 on the SAT, and then 1 to 36 overall with a 1 to 36 per section on the ACT. So one way to kind of gauge this comparison is that on the SAT, math is 50% of your score. And on the ACT, math is 25% of your score. So depending on how great you are at math, you might want it to be 50% of your score, or maybe you want it to be 25% of your score. Now, part of that is also going to depend on how you do on the other sections. So, for example, I was really strong at math. I had a really high SAT math score. It was higher than my reading and writing score at the time because we actually had a different section at that time. The test was a little bit different, and I still did great, but my reading and English scores on the ACT were actually slightly higher than my SAT verbal scores. And so even though I was awesome at math, I was also really strong on ACT science. So that still made it for me personally that the ACT was actually at that time a better test for me than the SAT. So again, these are all the things that you need to think about. You have to weigh in all the different factors. Another thing we'll talk about for scoring is super scoring and how schools are going to look at your tests. So if you take the test multiple times, on the SAT, most schools are going to do what's called super scoring. They're going to look at how you did on your tests and take the best score for your math and the best score for your evidence-based reading and writing, and they're going to create a super score. So just as an example, let's say that you took the SAT the first time, you got a 600 on reading and writing and a 700 on math. That's awesome. So that gave you a 1300. And then the next time, which is a really good score, I just gave you a really good score. And then the second time you took it, you got a 700 on reading and writing. You flipped your scores, and a 600 on math. So each time you got a 1300, but if you super scored it, you took the 700 from math the first time and a 700 from evidence-based reading and writing the second time, combine those together, you now got a 1400. My goodness, like that's jamming. So that is going to be super scoring, and that's awesome that schools do that. Now, not all schools do, and schools will even change their policy from year to year. And some schools, even though they do look at it that way, they also will still kind of look at trends. So if you took the test over and over, they might look at that, and they might wonder like what was going on, or if you have like severe dips in your scores, even though they look at the super score, they still might think about those factors. So like you still got to be a little bit careful, but that is kind of a nice component of the SAT. Whereas on the ACT, it's much less likely that schools do that. Schools typically are going to look at your overall highest composite score and then whatever scores you got that day. So let's say that your highest composite score on the ACT was a 29. And maybe you had like your English, math, and reading were all pretty close clustered to that 29 because it's just an average. But your science was the thing that kind of like brought you down. So maybe on that day that you got your 29, the science, you got a 25. And then maybe you took the test another time and you got still a 29, or maybe actually you got a 28. You got a lower composite score, but your science score you had brought up. You brought it up all the way to 28 from 25. Well, schools won't really care. They're going to look at your overall composite for the most part. That's what most schools will do. So it's just a little bit different, and that can also help you to decide if you should take the test again, depending on how you think you could do better. So that's something that we do offer to our students, is being able to take the test again and study with us again, and I'll talk more about that program later. Okay, the final thing, and you guys can actually help me with this one. Which test, the SAT or the ACT, has a wrong answer penalty, where you would lose points if you get a question wrong? Which test? Do you guys know? So on the SAT and the ACT, if you get a question right, you get points. That's how it works. So like we saw on the PSAT, just by filling out your name, you got a 320. And then for every question you get right, that's how you raise your score. So you're improving your score when you get questions right. But actually, and there used to be, so I see like Jyoti's saying there's a penalty on the SAT, Angelina's saying on the ACT. This was one trick question, guys. There's no penalty on either test. There used to be a penalty on the SAT, and that actually could have influenced whether you should take the SAT or the ACT because it changed your test strategy. Neither test has a penalty anymore, and the PSAT doesn't have a penalty either. So what that means is if you get a question wrong, you just don't get points on that question. It's the same as if you left it blank. But another way to think about it is you should never leave a question blank. This is my first strategy I'm going to teach you guys for improving your scores on the SAT and the ACT, or helping your student to improve their scores on the SAT and the ACT, which is that you should answer every single question on the SAT and the ACT and never leave a question blank. Because the worst that happens is that you don't get points. But the best that happens is that you get the points. So you could even just guess, right? And if it's a multiple choice question with 4 answer choices, A, B, C, D, you get a 1 in 25, or not a 1 in 25, a 1 in 4 chance, which is 25% chance of getting it right, just by blindly guessing. So I always guess answer choice B, or on the ACT, it flips the answer. So B or G on every question. If I don't know the question or don't have time to do the question, I will just guess B or G, and then that helps me to get the question right. B for Beth, or B for the best answer on the test. Okay, so that is some of the logistic factors of the SAT or the ACT. But let's talk about the content differences between the ACT and the SAT. And we'll start off with the section of the test that has the fewest differences. That's the writing and language section on the SAT, or the English test on the ACT. So they have different names, but they test the exact same thing, which is essentially like grammar rules and like sentence structure and things like that. For most people, in fact, to like most people that aren't like Kaplan teachers who have a ton of experience with these tests, they're not even going to be able to look at a question and tell you whether it is the SAT or the ACT, because that's how similar these tests look. But we do know the differences, and we can help our students to succeed on both tests. The main difference between the two tests is that while they test the same content, the SAT just has a little bit more questions, a higher frequency of questions on effective language use. And the ACT has a few more questions on sentence structure. Both test effective language use and both test sentence structure, but the ACT just weighs a little bit more heavily towards sentence structure and SAT more on effective language use. Because this section is so similar on the two tests, this is not really the one that we would recommend deciding whether the SAT or the ACT is better for you on. They're really, really similar. And this is also one of those sections where by studying for one, you're really going to improve your score on the other. So there is some of that overlap. But let's talk about the sections that have more differences. So we'll go to reading. Reading on the SAT is technically called evidence-based reading, and then on the ACT it's the reading test, but basically it's the same thing. And again, it's really similar. The SAT, though, has longer, wordier passages. The SAT then also gives you more time per question because there are longer, wordier passages. And the ACT is going to feel a little bit more like a time crunch. There's less time per question. And then while there are the same question types on the SAT and the ACT, and Kaplan actually has a question strategy for every single type of question. So like there's 4 question types listed here. There's global and detail and synthesis and rhetoric. There's vocab and context questions. There's a bunch of other question types. We have a strategy for every single type that we teach our students in our Kaplan classes. But again, the SAT just skews more heavily toward those synthesis and rhetoric questions, which are the higher difficulty question types on the reading. And the ACT skews more towards those global and detail question types, which are the lower difficulty questions on reading. And that's partially because of the timing. You have more time on SAT to think and process things, so harder questions on average. And then ACT, less time per question, so more of the lower difficulty questions on average. But again, you have to remember that everything is scaled. So if everyone's getting these questions right on the ACT, then it's harder to get to those higher level scores. So everything ends up balancing out. It's just again, a way to show, like, if you're amazing at reading comp, maybe you can shine more on the SAT with those higher difficulty questions, or maybe you're awesome on the ACT despite the time crunch. Students really struggle with that. So those are differences as well. As long as we're doing kind of like these verbal topics like English and reading, let's talk about the essay. So we haven't talked about the essay yet. That's because there actually is not an essay on the PSAT. It's only a multiple choice test. But both the SAT and the ACT do have an optional essay. So while the PSAT isn't really going to help you to decide, like, should you take the essay or which test is better for you based on the essay because there was no practice, we'll give you some tips here. So first of all, the essay is optional on both tests. And that's because only about 13% of colleges require either the SAT or the ACT essay. Neither requires one over the other. They just say, like, we require one of the essays. And again, that was only about 13% of schools. Some schools recommend it, and as I'm sure you can guess, if a school recommends that you do something, you should do it. But the essay is optional, and so you should just take it if you need to. But if you don't know yet if you need to, so like let's say you're a junior and you don't really know where you want to apply to colleges yet, we would recommend taking the essay because you cannot take the essay on its own. You can only take the essay if you take it with the whole test. So let's say that like you study with Kaplan, you get a great score, maybe in April or May on your SAT or your ACT. You're all set, and then you go to apply to colleges and you realize that one of the colleges you're really interested in wants the essay. Well, now it's been a long time since you've taken the SAT or the ACT, and you probably are going to actually have to study again because you're going to have to submit that test score. Like, you can't choose to not submit it because you have to submit it if you want your essay score included. And then schools are going to see that, and that's going to be your most recent test. So even if they super score, they're still going to maybe wonder, like, if you drop down, like, what happened. So you definitely, if you don't know, want to take the essay. Now, the essay is not really a reason to choose one test over the other. Focus on your multiple choice sections because the essay does not contribute to the composite score on either test. It is scored completely separately, and it's just a little bit different on each test. On the SAT, it's a little bit longer. That's kind of the trend on the SAT, a little bit longer. 50 minutes, the ACT is 40 minutes. The SAT requires you to read and analyze a pretty lengthy prompt, 750 words or more prompt, and then you have to be an objective analyst. And on the ACT, you have less to read because there's less time, and you have 3 perspectives that you have to read, and then you have to choose a perspective and argue your side. So it's a different essay, but they are going to both test kind of the same thing, which is, do you follow directions? Can you write effectively? And create your argument that they're asking for. So that's how the essays work. Okay, so now let's talk about the sections of the test that are more different. That's going to be math and then science. So we'll talk about math first. So on the SAT, it's just like the PSAT, in which there are 2 math sections. On the ACT, there's only 1 math section. The SAT has a non-calculator math section and a calculator math section. And I'm curious from you in the chat, like, which do you prefer? A lot of students get kind of scared about the non-calculator section. And then some students love it because they are really conceptual and critical thinkers and they can really shine on that section and don't need their calculator. So that's one thing to kind of think about. Another thing is that on the SAT, it's actually not all multiple choice in the math. Some of the SAT questions are what are called grid-ins. These exist on the PSAT as well. Again, it's the practice SAT. And the grid-in is where there's just a little like grid that you have to fill in with your own answer. There's no like clues as to what the answer can be, except that it cannot be a negative number. That's really the only clue that you get. And so you have to figure out what the question is. Whereas in the ACT, theoretically, you could guess on every question. You could have a shot at getting it right. I guess you could still guess on a grid-in, but it'd be pretty hard to just blindly guess and get a question right on the grid-in. So some students kind of freak out about that too. They like having those answers there. Another trend, we've been seeing this, the SAT has those wordier questions than the ACT. Now, the ACT, though, it is going to test a little bit more heavily on geometry and trigonometry. Both tests test geometry and trigonometry. They also both test arithmetic and algebra 1 and algebra 2. There's like stats and probability that come from algebra, but the ACT is going to test more on geometry and trig than the SAT. So that's another thing to think about. Now the final section of the ACT, which is really different than the SAT because the SAT does not even have a separate science section. The SAT science is going to be interspersed throughout all the sections. So there's going to be science on the reading and writing section, on the reading and writing sections, and in math. And you'll get a subscore of science on the SAT and on the PSAT. Actually, you can see a science subscore. And colleges will look at that, but not nearly as seriously as they're going to look at the science score on the ACT because it's one of the sections of the test. Now, some people will be like, oh, I'm going to apply to be pre-med, or I'm like amazing at biology, so therefore I should totally take the ACT. Or some people are like, physics is the scariest thing I've ever seen. I'm terrible at chemistry. I'm awful at labs. I definitely should take the SAT. And to all of those people, I will say, nope, that's not how it works. It doesn't matter what you're applying to. It doesn't matter whether you're good at or bad at science classes. What matters is your scientific thinking. That's what's actually being tested in science. It's not testing science content knowledge. It's testing whether you can be a critical thinker, because as we talked about before, that's what colleges really care about. Are you going to be a critical thinker? So they're going to ask you questions like, based on this data, what's the conclusion you should draw? Or if this was changed, what would happen? Or is this a valid conclusion? Should we draw this conclusion? Or what's the trend that we're seeing in this data? So sometimes people who, they hate science, but they love this kind of stuff. They like data. They like analyzing things. They like to be able to critique conclusions. Maybe there's somebody who wants to be like a poli-sci major or law student at some point. Those students might love this section of the test. So don't go off of whether, just because it says the name science, it's really scientific thinking. So that's something to really keep in mind. Okay. Now, that's a lot of information, and I'd love to hear from you guys now. Vote in the poll again, whether you think the ACT or the SAT is going to be best for you or your student. And while you vote for me, I'm going to tell you another really, really helpful way to decide. That is to take a free practice test on the ACT and the SAT. And Kaplan offers free practice tests for both the SAT and the ACT. We even actually also offer free practice tests for both. In fact, we have a combo test, it's called, where you can take both tests on the same day, coming up in just 10 days. On December 27th, we have a combo test. It's totally free, and that way your student can be exposed to both tests. They're going to get their scores right away, and they'll be able to see how they're doing. And then what we want you to do is, of course, compare, like, did you score better on one or the other, but then also, which one do you feel like you have more potential to score better on? Because that's what this is all about. Everything is about demonstrating your potential to colleges and being that competitive advantage, or getting that competitive advantage when you're applying. So that's what we really want to help you to do. We really encourage students to take a practice test with us. It's totally free, and then that way we can help tailor that plan for you even more. All right, so once you do decide whether you're going to take the ACT, the SAT, or both, some people will still choose to take both, that's when you need to make that plan of how you're going to get that best score that you possibly can. So anytime that you're going to be studying for a test, you want to be getting that highest score that you can. Really show your highest potential. Put your best foot forward. And the way to do that is to have three main boxes kind of checked. And I see that still about 60% of you are thinking both and 30% SAT. No one thinks the ACT. That's even more reason that you should take the practice test, because you might be surprised the ACT is going to be better for a lot of students. Okay. What you want to do, though, is make sure that when you're preparing, you have guaranteed score raising strategies. This is not like taking a high school test. These tests are different. They're going to test different skills. And so while there is going to be geometry content or grammar rules that are tested on the ACT and the SAT, it's not just the content, it's about how to apply that content. And you want to make sure that you're going to have score raising strategies for every section of the test. At Kaplan, we have strategies that we test over and over. We have a team of learning scientists and psychometricians and product experts, and then, of course, our amazing teachers who help shape our curriculum as well based on student feedback and student success. And we actually guarantee that our strategies are going to work for our students. We guarantee that our students are going to score higher, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. You want to make sure that when you choose a test prep plan, you have strategies for every section of the test. You can't just study using your textbooks. You also want to have overall testing strategies for time management and pacing. So if on the SAT, it's long and wordy, like how do you break through that? On the ACT, time is a crunch. How do you master that? How do you reduce your anxiety on the test? Because a lot of students get test anxiety, and even though they know all the content, it's the test itself that's throwing them off. You want to have strategies to overcome all of those things. Get those points. And then finally, you really want to make sure you have focused practice. Let's talk about both elements of that, and we'll actually start with practice. So you want to be practicing, again, on test-like questions, realistic test-like questions that are going to mimic the experience your students are going to have. At Kaplan, we actually have 8 full-length practice tests for our students to take that are really realistic. We measure them and standardize them to make sure that they're going to be accurate predictors for our students. And then they get feedback on how they did so they can practice even more. We've got workshops and quizzes and the ACT and SAT channel, which I'll talk about more. We have QBank, which is a way that students can make customizable quizzes based on the content that they need. And that kind of brings us to focused. We don't want students to just study everything. If a student does that 50 hours of studying that I was talking about before, and I just picked a number, but just to continue with the number I had picked, if they're going to study for 50 hours, we want them to study the right things for 50 hours. So for example, if your student is looking at their performance on math, and maybe the 2 biggest areas that they're struggling on, which the Kaplan score reports, which we call SMART reports, are going to tell them, if maybe the 2 biggest math areas that they need to work on are functions and irrational numbers. Well, irrational numbers is only going to be like 1 or 2 questions on the test, whereas functions is going to be a lot more questions. And so what we would do is tell them, you know what, you need to focus on functions. Functions is going to be the area where you're going to have a much greater potential for improvement. because you can earn a lot more points by studying functions. And then how about we have you focus on those function assignments? We've got a function workshop. We've got a function quiz. We've got videos that you can watch. We can have you go to a live session about functions. There's a chapter in the book about functions. There's QBank questions about functions. We have all of these resources that your student can tailor to their needs. And that's what you really want to be looking for in any test prep program. So I was talking a little bit about the channel, and the channel is one of my favorite resources because the channel is one of my students' favorite resources. Students who go to the channel love it. It's basically like Netflix for the ACT or the SAT. And I love when my students love a resource because that means that they use it, right? And like what high school student or any student is like, yes, please give me more homework. I want all the homework. I would love to practice the ACT today. Like most students aren't like that. So when they do find a resource that they love, we love it. We actually have our students rate our channel sessions just like they would on Netflix. Like was this, we have them rate on kind of a scale. It's not just thumbs up or thumbs down. It's more like the old Netflix ratings of stars. But based on that, we know which programs are great. We offer more of that. We also choose which teachers are the best teachers. And so we have our great channel prep squad that teach our channel sessions. We have over 30 hours of programming that students can choose, and they can watch it on demand like Netflix or even live. We've got channel sessions on the essay. We've got channel sessions on advanced geometry, basic math, every single topic area that you could possibly want. We've got it, and it's all available on mobile and computer to our Kaplan classroom students. So let me talk to you about our Kaplan classroom plans. Now for our freshmen and sophomore parents and students out there, you're going to really want to be thinking about prepping for the PSAT. That's going to be coming up in October of your junior year. We recommend studying for about 3 months. That sounds like a long time, but these are not tests that you can cram for. So we have our PSAT courses. We've got our prep courses, self-paced. Prep is going to be a live online or in-person course. We offer both. We have tutoring as well. But I really want to focus for our parents of freshmen and sophomore. I want to talk about unlimited prep. This is my #1 recommendation if you have a student who is a sophomore or a freshman. The reason is because unlimited prep is going to come with our PSAT course, which as you can see is $4.99. Our SAT course and our ACT course. SAT and ACT courses individually are $8.99. So you'd be adding up $4.99, $8.99, and $8.99, but instead of paying that price, you're paying $15.99. It's a steal. But here's where it gets better. You pay it once, $15.99, and you get access to all of those courses as much as your student wants. They can take the live courses in person or online as many times as they want, all the way starting today when you get it, all the way through December of senior year, which is when that's the last chance to take the ACT and the SAT and apply to college. So it is an amazing program. This is also really great for, I know about 60% of you are still thinking it's going to be best for your students to take both the ACT and the SAT. This is the program for you then. Study for the PSAT for junior year. Start working on the ACT or the SAT now. Choose one to focus on and then work on that and then work on the other. You really don't want to be working on both at the same time. But with unlimited prep, you have the resources to do that. You get all of our books, our videos, the channel, everything for this one great price. So that's my #1 recommendation for sophomores and freshmen. For my juniors out there and families of juniors, my #1 recommendation for you is going to be a prep course. That's because at this point, you really should choose either the ACT or the SAT. If you really need to do both, like there might be some other things that you can focus on later, and we do have something called Prep Plus where you can actually get resources to both. But I would recommend choosing one for now, ACT or SAT, and getting the course. It's $8.99. Now though, because you came here today, we actually have a great offer for you, which is Success 250, and it's going to give you $250 off of our prep courses. So if that is good through tomorrow. That might be fast. So I also have one other code for you, which is Prep 250. This is going to be good for live online only, and it is good for 7 days. So you can purchase in person or live online through tomorrow for $250 off, or for 7 days, you can purchase live online for $250 off using that code. That would be my #1 recommendation for juniors. Okay, once you prep, you're going to take the official test as we talked about, and you want to make sure that you get that higher score. And I told you earlier about our higher score guarantee. We guarantee that students are going to get a higher score on their test when they study with us. And if not, we give you your money back. But of course, that's not really what you want. You want your students to show their potential and show how great they are at colleges. So we also say that if they don't get a higher score, even if they do, but they still think that they could do better, we will give them the course again for free if they want to take it again for free. So I had a student named Lindsay who took the SAT course with me in March. And she had come in, she had taken the SAT previously and gotten an 80th percentile score on her SAT. And with me in our one class, we just did one prep course, she got her score up to a 94th percentile. So she had a really substantial improvement, but she wanted to go to Dartmouth. That was like her dream school. So she decided she was going to take the class again for free. She studied again and she raised her score even more. And that was all for free because she had signed up for a live online prep course. So again, we are here to help your students succeed and get into college, and that is why we offer this. So the last step, right, is apply to colleges. And while we're not going to apply to college today, I will tell you that 9 out of 10 Kaplan students get into one or more of their top choice colleges. And I'm sure you see there's like some fine print down there, and usually when there's fine print, it's like, well, what does that really mean? I would love for you to read this fine print because it's something that we're so proud of. It tells you that this was actually true for May 2012, May 2013, May 2014, May 2015, and May 2016. We don't have the data for 2017 yet, but this was true for 5 years in a row. We're so proud of it. And we would love for your student to be one of the 9 out of 10 who get into one or more of their top choice colleges because they are studying with Kaplan. So we would love to have you. Again, we do have those great offers for you this week. You can use this. And again, my #1 recommendation for freshmen and sophomores is unlimited prep, and for juniors is prep. So thank you all so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it. We do have a ton of free events coming up later this year. We have that SAT, ACT practice test this year, and then a ton of great events into 2018, our Journey to College series, where your students can continue to prepare and get those high scores so that they can get into the colleges that they want. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for coming. Please do let us know if you have any other questions. We're so glad that you were here, though. And yeah, we're here to help. We hope to see you in another Kaplan classroom soon. Thanks, everyone.